Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the introductory episode of the American Indian Wars podcast. Wait,
Hey, hold on a
excuse me, it's the Native American Wars podcast.
No, Greg, we feel that we should be using the native indigenous peoples as opposed to these other terms.
Well,
I'm fine with Native American Wars podcast.
so we're calling it the Native American Wars podcast.
I understand that that's what you two are calling it.
I'm good with that.
Okay.
2 against 1.
True.
Oh yeah.
This is a democracy, is it? All right.
My
go ahead,
name's
Greg.
Greg Franklin, and these are my esteemed colleagues, Mike Ramsey
That's
and
me.
Fritz Beer.
Hello.
I want to make it clear that we're not experts in the field of American Indian. Oh, did I say it again? Native American history.
Can we get through this without
We're just
slurring people, please?
we're just enthusiasts. Our mission here is to provide a narrative about the wars from first contact. By first contact, I don't mean 1492. Mike's first episode is gonna talk a little bit about Norse contact.
Yes, we have some pretty good evidence that the Norse were the first European contacts. That's where we get our word "skraeling" from. And we're going to talk about this very interesting group of Canadian Native Indigenous peoples and their contact with the family of Eric the Red, a murderer from Iceland, and the disappearance of both the Norse people and the Dorset people.
We plan on our show's episodes to follow a timeline. After delving into Norse contact, we'll visit the islands of the Caribbean simply because we believe that Columbus and those that followed are important to the narrative. We'll then encounter conquistadors on the mainland. With the exception of covering Spanish conquest in the Southwest a little bit, we will basically follow the path of Western expansion.
Fritz, are those wagons?
We'll cover DeSoto and Chief Tuscaloosa. We'll go to John Smith and Pocahontas, from King Philip's War to the Pontiac Confederacy. We'll introduce you to Tecumseh and William Henry Harrison. The French and Indian War we'll cover, which was an extension of the 7 Years' War in Europe. We'll also
Wait a second. Hang on. So, but Pocahontas, that's real, huh?
Oui,
Tecumseh, that's real.
c'est real. Yeah. Right.
I thought that was just fairy tale stuff, but yeah, I really don't know anything about this. But yeah, so go
This
ahead.
is not
Now you're drawing me in.
this is not a Disney story, Fritz.
Okay.
We'll cover Queen Anne's War, which was a war fought mostly in Europe, but also on the North American continent. We'll ride along with Andrew Jackson in the Red Stick War,
C'est Baton Rouge. Oh.
Red sticks.
and we'll cover the more famous Plains Indian Wars. Famous warriors such as Quanah Parker in the Red River Wars, Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, and Crazy Horse, and not to mention George Armstrong Custer. Damn, thanks a lot, Fritz. Our recording engineer, Fritz Beer, has come across some exact sounds from the Battle of Little Bighorn. Thank you.
I think he recorded those himself while he was there.
We're going to take you to the Southwest for Coronado and the Pueblo Wars, to Kit Carson and the battles with the Navajo. Everyone's familiar with the Apache Wars, Cochise and the medicine man Geronimo, But what about Magnus Coloradus and Victorio? Have you ever heard of them? Have you ever heard of Captain Jack and the Modoc Wars?
Modoc, isn't that a part for a Chrysler? Mopar? Sorry for interrupting, Greg.
Anyway, and we'll tell you why Chief Joseph finally, when he surrendered, finally said, "I will fight no more forever." We'll cover the Native American culture and customs. We'll talk about their weapons and tactics, what they ate, what they wore, how they wore their hair, the role of women, talk about the religion. And we don't want to forget, this is also a podcast about not only the Native Americans, but those who fought against them. So we're going to talk about people like Roger Williams in Connecticut and William Henry Harrison and what their point of view was. We're going to try to cover both sides of this in a fair manner and call it like we see it. And I think that's all we can do.
I agree, Greg. And just as a talking point to contextualize some of this, we have to, I think, as we're talking about things that happened in, 1600 or 1100 or whatever, we have to sort of transport ourselves back to 1100 or 1600 or 1492 or whenever, and look at not just what we think now
in the context of the world that they lived in
and who they were and their cultural backgrounds and their cultural heritage from on both sides of this series of contacts. Okay,
so why start a podcast about the Native American Indian Wars? Well, I'm a huge fan of history podcasts, and podcasting in general. The first podcast that I began following was, well, no big surprise here, was Mike Duncan's History of Rome. I loved it, I devoured it, and after that, resistance was futile.
We are the Lord. You will be assimilated. Resistance is futile.
Yeah, I'm a pretty big nerd too. And after listening to Duncan, I wanted more. I started doing research and found out how spectacular the world of podcasting and history podcasting in general was, and I totally immersed myself. I was listening to a lot of ancient history podcasts, and I was getting a little burnt out on it, and I began expanding, and when I tried to find some podcasts that dealt with the Native Americans, I was pretty disappointed. The one exception was a podcast called the Iroquois History and Legends podcast, which I really enjoy, but it just covers the Iroquois Nation. And it seemed like such a great subject, and it got such little love, and I didn't know why it was. Was it because it was a controversial subject, or it was a question of political correctness? Nobody wanted to touch it. I assume that's probably had a lot to do with it. And I just kind of noted to myself that the subject needed to be addressed, and now we're addressing it.
And we're just the dummies to address
Yes, we are. We are some serious dummies. Okay, so some time went by, and I started thinking more about doing a podcast, and I realized that I already had my subject. And one afternoon, Mike Ramsey, my co-host, stopped in at Elijah P's for a beer where I work. Elijah P's Burgers and Brew in Alton, Illinois. 60 taps, and the food is great, by the way.
C'est magnifique.
Sorry, shameless plug there. We're getting paid for that. And I knew that Mike had an interest in history, and I figured military history since he was an ex-paratrooper and actually saw action in Grenada. And I asked Mike if he listened to many podcasts, and he told me that not so much, but I told him about my plans, and he was like, count me in. Our next step was getting Fritz Beer, our award-winning singer-songwriter buddy, on board. Fritz, our music guy. His presence, I think, will allow us to do some things that your average history podcast can't pull off, or so we hope. Anyway, here we are. Don't get me wrong, I love the format of the great history podcasts. However, we believe not only should we be informative, but also entertaining. Not only will the Native American Wars podcast be text-oriented, but we're also going to do a roundtable discussion, and we plan on doing interviews, live shows, remote shows, and also a heavy dose of good music, hopefully. And when you have a musical talent like Fritz producing your show, it allows you to do some different things. And anyway, we plan on being a little eclectic.
Exactly. Eclectic is the key. In particular, we don't want anyone focusing on the accuracy of our remarks, per se.
I mean, the history will be right.
Right. I mean, but here's the thing: what we say will generally be accurate or at least somewhat verifiable. But the key thing is we want to talk about the stories, and some of the stuff you just can't verify. You've got for instance, I'm going to talk about Eric the Red's family. And that stuff there's some sagas, and then there's some archaeological and anthropological
By
evidence.
Eric the Red, do you mean he was a Native American?
No, but you have to also
that's offensive.
you have to also remember the native indigenous peoples that contacted Eric the Red. All we know about them is what we hear from the sagas, plus anthropological and genetic evidence, archaeological evidence, but we don't know we can't really say that we know anything positively about that set of contacts. And when you bump that forward into the 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue stuff, yeah, you've got more written records, but once again, we don't really know where he landed. We don't know what peoples he ran into. We're just sort of taking an educated, when I say we, I mean people that actually study this stuff, not me.
I mean, when you say that, Mike, and I understand that you are Mike Ramsey is an attorney,
Yes.
and he's our attorney, by the way.
I
When
am.
he says when he's saying that kind of thing, it's a little bit of our.
He's our conscience. Is he our conscience?
He's protecting us in a sense.
My
By
representational
saying we don't know jack.
my representational duties include these sorts of disclaimers at the beginning of
Beginning.
Okay, well,
endeavors such as this.
Speaking of that, I'd like to take a couple minutes to talk about political correctness. Okay, the three of us, we're aware that it's a pretty controversial subject. We've discussed this amongst ourselves, and we want to be sympathetic to the beliefs of all parties involved. That being said, we're going to still call it like we see it, meaning that after doing research, we're not going to be afraid to judge a particular historical figure or situation. We're going to do it, and if that hurts somebody's sensibility, well, it's not anybody's intention to do that. That's just how we see it.
Sure,
And I'd like to remind everybody that we have a lawyer on staff.
Right.
okay, but the point is the point here, I think, is we certainly aren't claiming that everything we say is 100% right. And if you think we're wrong, we feel like you should contact us and tell us we're wrong and tell us about it, and we'll talk. We'll engage in that conversation with you.
This is Fritz Beer, award-winning songwriter, speaking, producer of the podcast. I don't know anything about this stuff, honestly, except what I learned in school. So to me, this is all. It's relatively new.
And it's interesting because you went to school around the same time I did. And the stuff that you and I learned in school is not the same stuff, because I have kids that are right now in middle and high school, and the stuff that they learned, because I go through it with them all the time, is not the same stuff that we learned.
Yeah.
You
Well,
know?
yeah.
So history changed.
And
No, but here's the one thing that I'd like to get out there is that I'm kind of like just really the technical guy.
and you're
But-
you're spectacular, by the way.
Oh, thank you. No, thank you.
Jeez, what a positive stroke.
I really like the stories, because now we've done a little bit of practice time and I've heard the stories, and it's true. To me, it's like you were saying earlier, the stories are fantastic. They're phenomenal. It's just great to hear. I don't know a lot about this, and it's not an interest of mine per se, but hearing you guys tell the stories of this, I think it's going to be a great adventure. It's going to be fun.
Just remember, folks, in the subject we're trying to cover here, there is enough atrocity on both sides to go around. So Nobody's hands were clean on this.
There's going to be enough atrocity here, I think, at this table.
Well, I think that
I think there already has been.
we're gonna definitely point out the quote atrocities unquote that occurred, and it's very clear that European society, when it ran into native indigenous peoples here, there were a lot of consequences, intended and unintended. In essence, what we're talking about is a society when we bumped into the native indigenous peoples. Our society
God,
was.
you're gonna get tired of saying that all the time.
I may slip a couple times, and I apologize to anyone that's listening if they're offended by my slips.
You apologize if you ever say American Indian.
I do, but
All right.
when we run into this context here, we're talking about, in essence, a very primitive society, and I'm not talking about the native societies. I'm talking about European society when they got here. They were very primitive. I mean, let's face it. In 1603, what was the common cure for, let's say you had a common cold or something, right? Well, leeches, right? They bled you if you had ill humors. Anyway, the point is, we're not talking about the most advanced society in Europe. We're not talking about the most advanced society on the native continents, but we're going to talk about both of those societies in the context of who they are and where they came from.
We don't have PhDs here. We're learning as well. We're going to try to tell you people a story that we're learning as well. And we know quite a bit about the subject, but this is a process for all of us, and hopefully we're all going to have a good time doing it.
Hey, that's fantastic. It's a wrap for today for the podcast. Thanks everyone for showing up or listening or whatever it is that you're doing right now. We appreciate it. Give you all a positive stroke. And in the meantime, I want to encourage everyone to take a listen to the music surrounding this podcast. It's in the beginning. It's in the end. You might hear it rising up right now. But that music that's involved with this podcast belongs to Fritz Beer, our technical director / award-winning singer and songwriter. And you can own this music for your very own if you go to fritzbeermusic.com. That's one word, fritzbeermusic.com. And you can download the materials that you hear here, and you can download all the other stuff from his extensive catalog of musical hits. So thanks very much, and I'll hand it over to Greg to finish it out.
Come in and see us at Elijah P's Burgers and Brews in beautiful
downtown Alton, Illinois.
Got 60 plus taps, 100 whiskeys, seating for 300. Come see our beautiful lodge bar and our patio. I run banquets and events, and Russ Smith owns the joint. Come on in and see us.